This has been more or less a love fest. All of you are laudatory about what's been happening. I hear what you're all saying, that the ending of the revolving door, we've got good people, we have an ambitious agenda, but I jotted down 4 things of concerns that I want to get you to react to. One is, we've had good people, but they've been coming at very slow rate. What effect is that having? The president committed to doing an executive order and had an innovative process of involving public input, but that hasn't come. Has that made any difference? We had a promise of principles on scientific integrity. That also has not yet come. Does that make a difference? And then, Peg, you raised the spending freeze on domestic discretionary, although you said that the budget looks good for some of the regulatory agencies. This is going to have some impact, and I'm curious about that.
What we've tried to do throughout the year is open up these processes as much as possible to public input. And so in the areas of the Paperwork Reduction Act, with the executive order, on cookies policy, on open government itself, and many other areas, we have actually gone out to the public and said, and I think in an unprecedented way, tell us what you think. We want to benefit from your comments. In the area of the executive order and the reg review process in general, we did that for the first time ever and have received and reviewed carefully all of the comments. There were many, many comments, and met the timetables of the president's own memorandum in terms of ideas. But it is true that there is no new executive order at present, and I would say just a couple things. One, there is an awful lot on the plate since last fall through now. There have been huge issues that are being grappled with, and there's been a lot of regulation. We don't forget that has been coming through. And so many of the things that the president was talking about, the relationship with the agencies, open government, consideration of distributional effects and future generations and fairness, incorporating new ideas in behavioral economics like default rules and simplicity in regulation that makes things easier for the people to understand and react to, are things that are already being implemented in regulation. And if you would indulge me, I was just going to point out a few examples of this. Let's just take the Knox-Nax, which was recently published, or the SOX-Nax. That entire approach is supported by an environmental justice theory. The EPA is going out with a new approach to monitoring, which is cutting edge, and there is a fair amount of uncertainty around it, but it is going forward, and we're going to learn from experience. But it is fundamentally an environmental justice rationale that underpins that. And so you've got these roadside monitors, which tend to be located among populations that are at-risk populations or disadvantaged populations, and you have an additional 40 monitors which can be placed at various hot spots or appropriate points around the country by regional administrators. That's all a concern with distributional impacts that is animating that. Social cost of carbon, for which there has been an interim number arrived at through a consensus-based effort in the administration, and hopefully more to come on that. That employs a global cost of carbon, not a domestic cost of carbon, and it also employs a 3% discount rate as opposed to a 7% discount rate. That accommodates both impact on future generations in the use of that lower discount rate, but also a fairness concept in using a global value as opposed to domestic, because the greenhouse gas emissions that we emit in this country, I think it's hard to say, only have a domestic impact. That they, if we believe they have an impact, and we do, some don't, but if they do have an impact, it's surely a global impact, right? It doesn't stop at these amorphous borders. The behavioral economics area, there have been a lot of interesting new proposals to both use information to achieve regulatory ends, but also to use new default rules. So in the auto-enrollment, which the president has spoken a lot about for retirement savings, using an opt-out methodology will ensure that many, many, many more people will actually get the benefits of savings rather than an opt-in approach.
I think that the biggest constraint that we face is time and resources right now. Again, I don't think the requirements that are imposed on the regulatory agencies for developing and issuing major significant rules are enormous, and even the requirements on the small rules are big for, across the board, and then there are certain agencies that have these additional requirements. And unless there is some way to cut through those, streamline them, create certain presumptions, cross-utilization here, I am really, really concerned about the ability to produce rules that are actually on the books, protecting workers and protecting the public. And so that, concerned that we don't end up where we did at the end of the Carter administration, the end of the Clinton administration, with numbers of rules coming out in January in the Federal Register that were summarily stopped, reversed, killed by the subsequent administrations. And so I think that is a really important concern. I would say and encourage the folks at OMB and OIRA not to focus so much on new EOs and process and all that, but on results. And I think you are. I think focusing on getting things done, because if you don't get them done, so what, And we went through a lot of time in the Clinton administration reinventing government and all that, which at the end of the day, didn't do a whole lot in terms of adding to protections. And so the time issue is one, and then coming back to the issue of budget. This year, with a cap in place, again, the regulatory agencies did okay. But OSHA is sort of back to where it was in fiscal 2001, sort of real dollar terms. You keep a cap in place on that, they're back to where they were. The high point of OSHA, looking at numbers of people on staff and resources in real dollar terms, what they were doing was the Carter administration, both in terms of standard setting and enforcement. And we have a workforce that's almost twice as big as it was back then, and OSHA has 600 fewer people than it did, in 1980. So those are key issues here that I think need to be looked at and need to be addressed.
I think the question is can you disagree with someone on the science and yet not have that disagreement because they're corrupt and you're not? And I think that we have, in the environmental community, found ourselves at times in that situation. So to be fair to the administration, who, as I said, we give high marks overall, there have been some cases where we think they fell short on the science. For example, the Department of Interior, I think it's the tale of two departments. On one hand, the secretary is very visionary about wanting to move the department away from the old extractive industries of the past to renewable-based and recreation-based organization. But he's allowed Bush administration rules to stay in place on protecting certain types of wildlife, like wolves and bears, for example. We don't think that's supportable by the science. They left it in place. Mountaintop removal, a deplorable environmental practice that can't be mended, needs to be ended. The administration, at the beginning of its term, pulled back a number of permits to review them, are still reviewing some, have modified others, but they've allowed a number to go forward. But just at the end of last calendar year, a major scientific panel came out with an indictment of that practice that I think proves our case. So does that mean that the administration hasn't quite caught up with the science? Is it our job to convince them of that and their job to listen? And I think that you can have an honest disagreement of that sort that can cause a change in policy over time. So ultimately, they will be judged on their results. I think more successes than not to begin with. That could change over time. But do I believe that's what's necessary? I don't see the evidence at this point that what they need is some reform in their integrity, while at the same time I support them following through on their commitment to lay that commitment out.